Hello and welcome to this special Google Plus Hangout. My name is Diane Fender and I'm the Vice President of Girls Globe. We are a global network of young people and organizations raising awareness about the rights, health, and empowerment of women and girls around the world. Together with my colleague, Elizabeth Epstein, our social media director, we are here in New York City, and we have a special privilege today to be chatting with Nick Kristof, journalist, author, and activist, about his new book, A Path Appears. For those of you watching, we want to encourage you to participate in this conversation and use the hashtag AskNick or ask your questions in the comment box. During this Hangout, we will be taking several questions from the audience, so please tweet your questions and ask them. Thank you, Nick, so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, and also I should say that Sheryl sends her regrets that she's not here too. She would like to be here because right now she is sitting in Newark Airport on waiting for a delayed flight. So she sends her best.
Wow, thank you so much. So let's just get started, and I really would love to know what inspired you and Sheryl to write A Path Appears?
Well, after we wrote Half the Sky, then we spoke to a lot of groups, and we were emphasizing these, global challenges of empowering women around the world. And so many people would then ask us, so what do I do? And we keep encountering so many people who would like to make a difference, would like to have an impact, leave a legacy, and yet don't really know what they can do. They're worried about corruption, about inefficiency, about a sense that the world's problems are just too big for any one person to have an impact. And we felt at the same time that really there is an emerging evidence basis of things that do work. And so we kind of wanted to try to bridge that disjunction and provide some guidance for people so that they can make a difference more effectively.
Wow, that's really amazing. And I know I was really impressed by reading your book. I was impressed by stories like Dr. Abdi, who faced surmountable challenges in Somalia working to improve maternal and child's health. I was also impressed by stories like Kennedy Odede, who's working in Kibera slum to promote girls' education. So as organizations and individuals, how can we effectively empower grassroots initiatives that are already working to improve the lives of women and girls in communities around the world?
That's, I think, an important point that often it's those grassroots initiatives by local people that have tremendous local knowledge. Their cost of doing activities tends to be cheaper because they don't have international flights into places. They don't need big white SUVs running around, and yet they also lack those international connections to raise money. They may lack the latest kind of international knowledge about best practices or other things. So if one can bridge that gap and have these local players who have the local credibility, who are not outsiders and don't raise suspicions about imposition of foreign ideas, but really are accepted as leaders in the community, if you can also provide them with financial support, with the latest best practices, that's an incredibly powerful combination. And so we've tried to highlight a number of organizations in A Path Appears that we hope will be kind of a model for that kind of cooperation. You mentioned Dr. Hawa Abdi, who's she's working in Somalia, a female doctor, providing hugely important medical support, health support, and also just a kind of a role model for Somali girls and women, that a woman can be a leader, a woman can run a hospital, and we fight extremist jihadis with bombs. We can also fight them with role models and with education and with literacy. And I sometimes think that we so emphasize that military toolbox that we don't adequately emphasize these other toolboxes. And the same thing with Kennedy Odede, as you say, in Kenya. And there's so many others around the world. At the end of Path Period, we have a glossary with a number of these organizations, but it's obviously incomplete. There are millions of them around the world, and the problem is just kind of making people aware of each other.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just so inspired by that. I think what you said about just really, those that are at the grassroots really understand what's going on, and so it's important to listen and think of those people in the process. I think that's really a good thing.
Yeah, and there's also obviously in some cultural contexts, then there's a sensitivity to outsiders going in and promoting girls' education, for example. In Afghanistan, it works an awful lot better if it's Afghans talking about the need to educate girls than if it's a bunch of people from the West. And yet, those Afghan groups, and there are some, like the Afghan Institute of Learning, led by an amazing woman, Sakina Yaqubi, that if she can get the support from the West, which is partly financial support, but is also best practices in education and healthcare and so on, then that's so powerful. And so I commend that to everybody watching.
Great. Well, I think we have some questions from our audience, so I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth and see what questions we may have.
Yeah, hi. As Diane mentioned, I'm the social media director of Girls Globe, and I just wanted to take this moment to thank all of you who've submitted questions. I'm really excited to have your voices included in this conversation. So the first question I have is from the Capona Foundation, and they ask, how can small nonprofits have a maximum impact on the global stage?
There's no one answer to that, obviously, and I think we sometimes tend to kind of search for silver bullets when, as we write in a Path Periods, it's more about silver buckshot, lots of different things that kind of can raise your game a little bit. But I guess one of the things that I would emphasize is that often, traditionally, we kind of went on hunches and what we learned from a visit somewhere, and it was very impressionistic. And I think I think those impressions are really powerful and important. But I also think that now, in contrast to 15 or 20 years ago, we really have careful evidence about what kinds of things work and make a difference and at what price point. And I think bringing in some of that kind of business-minded mentality about metrics, about rigorous evaluation, about measuring long-term outcomes, randomized controlled trials where that's feasible. I think if that can inform this sort of deep knowledge of the ground, that is maybe the best way to try to get leverage and really have an impact.
Great. Thank you so much for that really inspiring and informative answer. And I think I'm going to bring it back to Diane for her next question.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Nick, in your book, you and Sheryl are very candid about the challenges that you faced initially investing in women and girls. I was just really impressed by your candor in the book. And, for example, your support of Greg Mortensen and just what you learned from that experience. So can you tell us what is one of the greatest lessons that you learned from some of those challenges?
Sure. I think one of the most basic lessons you learn is that helping people is harder than it looks, and that all kinds of things go wrong. And so whether it's Greg Mortensen, who I'm sure most people know, he was the author of 3 Cups of Tea, and then there were, and I visited some of his schools in Afghanistan, and they were indeed very impressive. But later there were really important questions raised about whether a lot of the money being raised wasn't being used to buy his books rather than actually leave an impact on the ground. And but just more broadly, so many times you come across an idea that seems really smart, seems to be working well, and then it just turns out to be a lot more complicated, or maybe occasionally even counterproductive. And in my travels, I've seen a lot of projects that were well-intentioned, but I have a friend who donated to build a well in South Sudan, and this should have been a life-saving intervention because people were dying of lack of clean water. And then the villages in the area got into a small war about who would control access to that well. You run into issues like that all the time. Helping people is hard. Yet on the other hand, when you travel, you also see interventions that have had an astonishing impact. And I guess I think of it a little like investing in stocks. That at the time you buy a share, you may think, oh yes, that's a great bet. It's gonna rise in value, and it doesn't always work out. And you make mistakes, and there are some that don't pan out. But on the whole, investments generally, there are going to be some that are going to do very well. And I think it's the same when one invests not to make money, but to try to have an impact around the world.
Yeah, those are some very great lessons. I think we can, I think all of us who've worked in global development have experienced some of the same challenges that you have faced as well. And I think, it's important to remember, not only learn from the challenges, but remember the positive stories of change. And at Girls Globe, we are really about highlighting the positive stories of change, what's happening, and not only critically looking at the issues, but also allowing young people and organizations to really share about the solid work that they're doing. So I just think that's such a key thing to not get discouraged in this movement.
Bravo, yeah, Diane, I think that's absolutely right, and it's kind of a fine balance. I think that sometimes in journalism, we focus so much on the problem. I mean, in journalism, we cover planes that crash, not planes that take off, and we sometimes leave the impression that all planes all the time are crashing. And in writing A Path Appears, this was this delicate tightrope because we wanted to acknowledge that there are a lot of nonprofits that are screw-ups and that aren't effective, and yet we also deeply believe that one can have an impact, that one can bring about change, and we want to encourage and inspire people, and yet we also want to be realistic about the challenges. And so, that's kind of a delicate balancing act that I think those of us who care about these issues have to figure out how to communicate that, yes, there are challenges, but there are also just tremendous opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know I was inspired from reading the book. I want to check back in with Elizabeth to see if we have any more questions from the audience.
Thanks, Diane. And yeah, we're getting a really good conversation here going on Twitter. So again, I want to encourage you all to submit your questions using the hashtag AskNick. So the second question from the audience is from Winfred Ongum. I apologize if I pronounced your name wrong. And she says, a girl needs self-esteem to raise her voice. How can we help girls build their self-esteem?
I think that is kind of a crucial question that we haven't addressed enough in the development community. And when we were writing A Path Appears, one of the things that was kind of new to me was indeed the research on the importance of self-confidence and hope and optimism, certainly for girls, but also for boys, frankly. And there's the economist Esther Duflo at MIT, she has argued very persuasively that one of the ways one of the ways in which a poverty self-replicates is because people kind of give up. They don't see a trajectory to a better life. And that one way of snapping that cycle is to give people some intervention that may meet their needs, but above all gives them some confidence. It gives them a map to a route to a better life, and then they become hopeful, and that hope becomes self-fulfilling. And so, for example, there's been work on child sponsorship organizations, and it really seems as if maybe the most effective way in which child sponsorship organizations work is not so much by providing that family with, a school uniform or a tin roof or access to a well, all of which is important, but maybe above all, with a sense that with support, confidence-building exercises, the belief in that child that if they keep on studying hard, that they can go on to high school, maybe to college, they can become a teacher, sort of raise their aspirational level. And I think that that's something we have to think about more, those of us who care about these issues, that it's not, that there's a deficit not just of clean water, not just of nutritious food, but perhaps above all of hope.
Okay, great. And we'll continue on with one more question. Thank you again for that really great answer. This second question is from Ella Harrell, and she asks, how can girls and women be urged to help change community residents to Ebola and help communities now with that issue?
How can women and girls be trained to respond to Ebola?
Yes, correct. And how can they help communities as a whole? In particular, in the sense of women and girls and how they're dealing with the Ebola crisis.
I mean, I think there are a couple of areas that are going to be that come to mind and that are going to be crucial. One is that we don't have enough formal health workers in these affected countries in West Africa. Liberia started this crisis with only 50 doctors in the entire country. And indeed, doctors and nurses and other health workers have been dying since it began. One needs to educate people around the country about how to detect Ebola, how to respond to it, how to be careful, that burial practices need to change, that if somebody has died of Ebola, then one can't touch the body above all. And there aren't enough formal health workers to try to engage in that sort of formal education. So I think that creates a big gap that can be filled by community volunteers, community educators, people who were trusted in the community. And I think that we can probably do a better job of finding women to fill that role of community education to support that role. And I think the other thing that we're going to have to think about in West Africa, as the cases multiply, and as they're, in Liberia right now, the number of Ebola cases is doubling every 2 to 3 weeks. There just aren't enough hospital beds to deal with that. And we may have to think about formally providing health care for people with Ebola in the home. But that is going to involve very different practices. It's going to have to involve giving out protective gear to family members, emphasizing that people in that house should be quarantined. It's going to mean delivering food. It's going to be a really complicated, it's far from ideal, but if you don't have hospital beds, then I don't really see an alternative, and I think it may be worth trying. It was done with smallpox, also an infectious disease. So I think those are two areas where we may be able to use community workers, and women are, ideally placed to fulfill some of these roles.
Great, and I actually heard the other day that 70% of the Ebola victims right now are women, because they are the majority of the healthcare workers and people caring for those that are deceased, and burying them and all of that. So that's a really major issue that we need to address.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so we'll take one more question from the audience, and this is from CCBRT Tanzania. And they say, how can we craft personal stories that convert empathy into support for our work to improve maternal health in Tanzania?
Great question, and that's one we write about in A Path of Fears, because it was a very personal question to me, and it arose because, for me, because I was writing about Darfur in particular and about maternal mortality. And it just felt so difficult to connect with my audience. People would think, oh, this is something happening a long way away. And so that led me into the research on what builds empathy, what builds a connection. And it turns out it's about two things in particular. One is it's about individual stories. We tend to try to make a case about the importance of an issue by saying, this affects X million of people, so many people in this broad area are affected. And in fact, that's kind of a turnoff. Our minds are probably hardwired to be empathetic to an individual in front of us. We have not evolved to be empathetic toward a class of millions of people. So what I do in my reporting is I try to find an individual story that is going to resonate with somebody else, and then that kind of opens up a channel. And again, the research is overwhelming that that empathy is an emotional process. It's not a rational one. And in fact, if you ask people to do math problems and then you present a story, they donate less. They're less empathetic, apparently because the math problems exercise the more rational parts of the brain, and the rational parts of the brain are not empathetic. So individual stories, an emotional bond, and the other lesson is that it should be a positive arc. It should show that people can make a difference. And I think, again, sometimes those of us who try to engage, we focus so much on things that are going wrong that we leave viewers or listeners with the impression that everything is all screwed up, that it's kind of hopeless, and that's a turnoff. So we need to show that, yes, there are enormous problems, but one can have an impact. One can make a difference. And sort of professional secret, if you look at our stories, both in Half the Sky and now in A Path of Fears, so often that's precisely the arc of the stories that we chose. That they're ones that, where there's some really terrible things going, where there's some tragedies, but we also try to show that there is kind of a hopeful arc, and that with some kind of support, there was a transformation taking place to encourage people to get engaged.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to give it back to Diane to ask the closing question. And if we do have a minute or two after that, I'll take one more question from the audience. So, okay. So, Diane, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, Nick. Your book shares powerful stories of young people as well. I was impressed by the stories of young people that are creating change for communities, for women, for girls. Today we see more and more people, and you talk about this in the book. Today we see more and more young people wanting to get involved, starting their own organizations, becoming social entrepreneurs. And wanting to really step out and make a difference, which is great. But what advice would you share with young global citizens who want to become involved, but also how can they make an effective impact for women in the lives of women and girls?
I guess maybe two bits of advice. One is that, as you say, I'm just a huge believer in social entrepreneurs and people having an impact, trying to do something. And a lot of the people that we tell the stories of are these individuals who started some amazing organization. On the other hand, frankly, one of the problems that we've seen is that everybody wants to start their own organization. And so there is this profusion of a million different organizations that often don't really scale up, and maybe after a few years, the founder gets busy or moves on, and the organization kind of fades away. And so I guess I would encourage people to also think about, instead of just starting your own organization, think about working within a existing organization and help scale it. There are a lot of organizations that have tremendous professionalism, tremendous local knowledge, and your efforts may accomplish more if you work within an existing framework. And the other bit of advice I would have is that, do your homework, and I hope that would involve reading A Path of Peers, but also go out in the field. That these are complicated issues, and you can't learn about them just by reading a book or just by watching a video. You kind of need to embed yourself in it to understand the complexities. And so if you have the chance to go and spend a few months or a year or whatever it may be trying to make a difference in the field at the very, very grassroots level, then that will be an experience that ideally will help you enrich the lives of others, but it'll also enrich your own life. It'll give you a much deeper understanding of how change comes about, of the challenges, of what works, what doesn't work. And maybe you'll pick up a language as well. Certainly you'll pick up more perspective. So I really encourage that kind of voyage into different societies, different lands, different cultures.
Great, and I know, Nick, you're a big advocate of taking a gap year in between high school and college. So I think that would be a great opportunity for young people around the world to really get involved in these issues.
Absolutely, and if you've missed a gap year before college, then hey, just take a gap year after college or in the middle of college or wherever it may be, or study abroad.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Nick, for just your time today. We've really, I think, I can speak for both Elizabeth and I, and also our audience, in saying that we've just really been enriched by this half-an-hour discussion, learning more about A Path of Peers, but really learning how we as individuals can really continue in this work, or even start in this work. I know I've been inspired by this conversation and feel a renewed motivation to continue in the work that we're doing at Girls Globe. So just thank you so much for being with us. I think together all of us in our different fields and spheres of influence can really make a difference in the lives of women and girls around the world.
Well, bravo to Girls Globe. You guys are at the cutting edge. Your help spreading the word, bringing about change, and you folks hold up, I'd say, way more than half the sky. So more power to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That means a lot coming from you.
Thank you.